Looks like everyone's joining, so I'll wait a minute while the attendee count goes up. Sean, I'm clicking the Q&A, but it's not opening, so there's a chance you might need to turn that on briefly.
I might be the only one that can see the Q&A because it is opened.
Mm-hmm.
I can actually see the Q&A. I don't know why, but
I know folks are joining now, but just a tip, if you're in full screen mode in Zoom, you will not see the Q&A unless you get out of that mode. And hello, everyone.
I will do that very briefly. Okay, great. I think I see quite a few people have joined so far, so we're going to get into it. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. It looks like we have a really great group for an important and timely topic. This is actually the third in a series of cure-based webinars on decentralized clinical research. The first one, which these are all available on our website if you'd like to watch, was on the topic of quality and oversight. The second was an IRB perspective. And today we're going to be diving into endpoints, particularly complex endpoints for decentralized trials, and expanding what's possible with what types of endpoints we can collect in a new decentralized design. Before we dive in, I'm going to give a really brief introduction on the topic and the format of the conversation today. We have 1 hour, and I'll be starting with a really brief overview of what we mean by complex endpoints and why they're so important to be thinking about right now. But we'll really save the large majority of our time for the discussion with our awesome panel, because each of these folks is really an expert in their domain, and they could each easily fill an entire hour or more just one-on-one themselves. So we want to make sure we have time to hear as much as we can from them. Additionally, we are going to be enabling the audience Q&A feature on the Zoom. So please submit your questions, and we'll try to save plenty of time so that we can address as much of those as are possible with the hour we have for us. So first off, diving in, I'd like to introduce the panel who's going to be driving so much of the conversation, and we'll go left to right on our experts. So the first is Craig Lipset, and I'll let him do a brief self-introduction.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and thanks for joining today. My name is Craig Lipset. It's a pleasure to be here with you, Tom. I lead an advisory called Clinical Innovation Partners and serve on a number of boards and as an advisor with different companies. By way of background, I ran Clinical Innovation Advisor for a number of years, and currently am on the faculty with a few different universities as well. That was a very rushed and haphazard introduction. My apologies.
All right, next we have Jamila Jemison. I'll let her do a self-introduction as well.
hello everyone, welcome. Thank you, Tom. Excited to be here. My name is Jamila Jemison. I'm the head of clinical development at HealthMode. HealthMode is a young, exciting company that works in the digital measurement space. So we work out all the measures that can go into your clinical, your decentralized clinical endpoints here. By training, a physician with specialty in pediatrics, and I have a large background across sort of biopharma, including oncology and inflammatory bowel disease and big data, as we continue to call it.
Awesome. Next is Irfan Khan. Irfan, if you could give yourself an introduction.
Thanks, Tom. Good morning and afternoon, everybody. I'm Irfan Khan. I'm a cardiologist, a principal investigator, and I'm a founder and CEO of Circuit Clinical, a decentralized trial network in upstate New York, and the makers of TrialScout patient engagement software. It's great to be here.
Awesome. Andy, you're next.
Hey, I'm Andy. I'm the CEO of Electra Labs, and we support companies that are using remote patient monitoring. So often that's for pharma that's doing decentralized clinical trials and using wearable sensors, other things that are like devices in your trials. Previously, I had served at the FDA in the digital health unit and worked on software as a medical device and the pre-cert program. And then by training, I'm a software engineer and had worked across management consulting and software.
Great, and I'll introduce myself. I'll be moderating today. My name is Tom Lundberg. I'm the CEO at CureBase. We run what we call virtual clinical research sites. So effectively, these are like normal research sites, but they emphasize at-home patient engagement, telemedicine engagement in clinical trials, as well as the use of local ancillary healthcare providers like mobile phlebotomy, community PCP, and other community specialists. We have built our own software platform that powers our virtual research operations, but we also have a clinical operations staff, including virtual PIs and virtual research coordinators to be a full GCP compliant site that can fit into larger trials and for fully decentralized trials, be the primary operator. Awesome. So there will be no shortage of good conversation. So first, introducing the topic, what do we mean by complex endpoints and what does it have to do with decentralized research? The truth is decentralized clinical trials are gaining a lot of rapid adoption, particularly right now in the current global situation. And that adoption is really strongest for studies that emphasize certain types of endpoints that we currently feel comfortable collecting remotely. So some of the obvious ones are PROs, patient-reported outcomes, endpoints that utilize mobile phlebotomy for blood-based measures, and a few other broadly accepted practices that we're comfortable doing remotely. But most clinical trial endpoints, most clinical trials will have endpoints that we aren't yet comfortable doing outside of the conventional research site visit. Endpoints that depend on, for example, imaging or physical exams or diagnostic procedures, more complex, for example, those that utilize colonoscopies or other similar procedures. So I could really go on. But honestly, most endpoints are what I would consider complex today and are still really tied and anchored to the research site visit. So it's now our job to pioneer new remote endpoints, new remote clinical operations methods, find ways to leverage new clinical settings like telemedicine and community healthcare providers, and build, quite frankly, brand new hardware and software technologies like digital measures to expand the sphere of what endpoints can be collected in decentralized designs. The reason this is important is because most clinical trials today, despite the enthusiasm, still cannot really benefit from the decentralized model because we aren't really yet prepared to collect the most critical endpoints outside of the typical site visit. Without a bulletproof, high quality, validated way of obtaining the key endpoints in a study, it's just not going to be decentralized despite whatever enthusiasm we may have. But if we can find new ways to collect them, then more trials can benefit from diverse patient access, from the enrollment speed benefits, from diversity benefits, lower costs, and the COVID-19 robustness that we see through decentralized designs. So based on our introductions, you'll know that every member of our panel does have a very unique perspective, and I think everyone here is doing something pioneering to move the needle on some way of expanding what the scope of complex endpoints and decentralized research can be. Some of these include everything from digital measures, so the very at-home focused approaches, but also approaches that emphasize the use of local healthcare providers, of obtaining really high quality, robust data in new ways, for example, imaging to drive the collection of imaging-based endpoints in new settings, safety, and additionally, we're going to be talking about some of the bigger picture as well, which is as we move these endpoints to be collected in new settings, how do we control the standardization, remove variability, and are there even limits to what can be done through decentralized endpoint collection? We're going to expand what our imagination is for how complex these endpoints can be and still be decentralized, but are there things that really should be done in the site-based context? Awesome. So now that we've introduced what we're going to be chatting about, we're going to dive into the panel discussion, and I'll be watching the Q&A closely. Great. So whoever would like to answer first, please go ahead. But I think a great place to start would be looking at just sort of where the industry landscape now is in terms of the adoption of endpoints in decentralized trials. Obviously, COVID-19 and long before that, there's been enthusiasm with adoption of decentralized approaches. Are there particular endpoints where we're seeing more successful adoption, more rapid utilization of decentralized methods? And what might those endpoints be today based on what you're seeing at your own companies and with your partners?
I think the opening place for many sponsors, at least, seem to have been in studies in probably one of two categories. Studies that were oral medicines that were relying on patient self-reported data where PROs were the primary endpoint, or there seemed to be a lot of comfort originally in dermatology indications. And I think that that's an artifact of dermatologists themselves having been at the forefront of a lot of telemedicine use cases. When you look at the origin story of companies like Science 37, they grew out of being a telemedicine, a teledermatology practice, really. And so I think that those seem to be a lot of the starting places, either because our endpoints themselves seemed like they were already being collected in the home, or because the provider community were already used to interfacing with patients in that disease area in a remote way.
I would say there's been a major shift just in the past year that's very COVID related. So last year, people were coming to us really looking for the next step, looking for innovation. So they'd come to us thinking about performance status sort of writ large, about the whole body and movement and dietary input and maybe getting some pain and some e-pros. And then now once COVID hit, particularly for folks who are in the middle of trials, first thing they're trying to figure out is who's safe. So they're looking for some understanding of COVID that they can get in the home. So that's been kind of a big thing. And then again, if they're already in progress, they're looking for ways that they can somehow make any of their other originally in-clinic assessments, if there's a way to get some sort of either proxy for them at home or actually duplicate them at home. So depending on what you're studying, if it's interventional, you need to obviously make sure you're getting your safety covered and that you're getting any of the outcomes that you're looking for with that intervention. But if you're also just looking for sort of progression or monitoring, you're possibly looking for two different things, something you could employ right now with studies that are already going on, or something that you might have to do down the road, which would require a little bit more planning.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Maybe to riff on it just a little bit, what we saw in physical sites was from sponsor guidance. When we hit sort of the bottom of the parabola and only 8% of the trial sites were open, everyone suddenly had an adoption mindset. It was definitely the mother of necessity. And if you think there's the history and physical exam that's common to both a clinic visit and a research visit. Then there's sort of the biometrics that you want to capture, and then the lab values. I think traditionally, sponsors were comfortable with the idea of outsourcing to the endpoints, as you mentioned, Tom. Very straightforward things you could either ask and answer via survey or look at. And Craig, I thought your point about dermatology was right on. I mean, it has the advantage of being visual, a very visual field. Cardiology, sort of, my home base, the idea of taking an endpoint at home that absolutely could have been done with, digital cystoscopy and things like that. Never on the plate until now. And suddenly what we're seeing is maybe they want to bring all those other things to the plate. I think that's the big shift right now.
I think it might make sense for anybody who's new to using Zoom. On the bottom of your screen, there is the chat list and then the Q&A list. And so for people who don't know, the Q&A is different from the chat. We just got a Q&A that I think might make sense for us to answer live, and then we can go back into the question. Sure. So Vicky asked us, what is a decentralized clinical trial? What does that mean? And I think that might be a good starting point, especially since we might have some Silicon Valley folks on here. So first, there are no blockchains in any of this talk. I hope this will be the last time we talk about blockchains for anyone from Silicon Valley. So the way I think about a decentralized trial, and I'll put a proposal out for the group and then we can all reply, is decentralized trials really mean multiple things. And one thing you'll notice is sometimes people use the word virtual trial, direct-to-patient trial, remote trial, siteless trial, all in the same way. These words are still changing quite a lot. So for example, the FDA used to use the term virtual trial. That has now been shifted off, and they're using the term decentralized. The word decentralized means quite a lot of things, and I would split it into two large types. So the first type is, where are you collecting the data? So are you collecting it at the site, or are you collecting it at home? So for example, telemedicine visits where you're doing a virtual, quote, virtual visit, maybe not the whole trial is virtual, you call in with a video. You may or may not collect endpoint data using a sensor in that instance. So that's really at home or at the site. And then I'll punt over after I explain the second part to Craig, who really thinks a lot about hybrid trials, which are where you have some visits at the site and some visits at home. Then the second thing is, how are you collecting the data? So are the data collected through intermediaries like people, or are you collecting blood draw data, or is the data being completely virtual or digital data? So you're collecting all that data through sensors or maybe through some sort of virtual survey. And you can imagine that you would use sensors at a site. So if you're running a Parkinson's study, you might use sensors on somebody's hands. So decentralized could mean the location or it could mean the data type. And honestly, it's pretty unclear what things people mean. So Vicky, this is a great question. And you should always ask companies when they say they're a decentralized trial company, what they actually mean by that. Like, what are the jobs that they're doing to, quote, decentralize it? Craig, do you want to talk a little bit about hybrid trials? And then for the rest of the panelists, anything you disagree with? I mean, these are new terms, right? So we're all kind of making it up as we go.
Thank you, Andy. That's a great call. And Vicky, that's a great question that you brought up here. And I think to Andy's definition makes a lot of sense for folks. And for those that aren't savvy on sort of traditional clinical trials, it's really about shifting location, that a traditional trial is all centered around an investigator site, a center in the trial itself, where patients are going in and out for various procedures and interactions, and decentralized shifts that location. But to Andy's point, I think it's important for us not to think about or get confused by or get sucked into the perception that there is one phenotype of a decentralized trial. And I think that's one of the limitations when we talk about a decentralized trial, because there is not a decentralized trial. Really, the way I think about this today is there is a library of decentralized research methods that we can apply to different studies based on the protocol needs, all of which can be brought together to shift location and enable more flexibility in how patients can participate. And the value prop that most sponsors are striving for today is, first and foremost in 2020, to have resilience, right, to support continuity during a pandemic. But outside of that, it's traditionally around improving patient access and participation. Can we drive more representative participation because we're removing the barriers that people have to take off from work and travel across town, but instead can participate in more flexible ways? To Andy's point, for a lot of studies, it hasn't been an all or nothing, that either it's all at the center or it's all from home, but that there's a continuum in between of these hybrid models. And hybrid might be sliced in one dimension. That means that some patients in the trial are going to a physical site and some patients are interacting through an online site. It could be sliced a different way on a visit basis, where the protocol itself is defining that visits 1, 3, and 5 require a clinic visit, and visits 2, 4, and 6 can be from home. And then I think there's the more progressive view on this, which is, to me, very much our holy grail, is to really enable location flexibility that gives the patients choice and control and lets them decide how and where they participate, just like we decide how and where we participate in most everything else in our lives. I think it's a great question. I'll be curious what Jamila or Irfan have to say on that.
Definitely want to second what you said, Craig, about decentralized being so important to include folks who have barriers to joining clinical trials, and also just reaching out to everyone. So that's one of my favorite things about them. For us at Health Mode, when we're doing decentralized trials, right now they have always been trials that we're sponsoring. We're using our technology, and they're not interventional. They're just sort of like feasibility data collection at first. And in that case, we were both allowing the patients to be at home and doing the data collection from them in the home. If there is a visit with a study coordinator, it's always via a Zoom conference or just a telephone check-in. And if it's even lighter touch than that, we can do an SMS or an email check-in. So when we're doing something with just our tech, right now, we can do it, as we think of, completely decentralized. Like there's never a time when the person has to come to a central site. That's easier with, again, something that's not interventional. When you start to put a drug or a device that's either administering a treatment on someone, you sometimes have to think harder about whether or not it's safe for them to be completely at home and not have any other sort of interaction with the physician. But that means we're employing a lot of things, right? So if we have devices, we have to send them to them. That means we have to make sure that they can connect things to Wi-Fi. There's a lot of training involved of the actual participants. And it's not the same as when you're sitting across from them in the clinic and can kind of hold their hand through how you do that. So you just have to be very thoughtful about the ways you get people enrolled and support them in those.
We have a question again from Vicky. So thank you, Vicky, about the regulatory adoption. I think the question I'll answer live is, could you briefly introduce FDA guidelines on DCT? I think to frame that a little bit in the context of this conversation, which is around the endpoints. You mentioned that especially during COVID-19, we're going into sort of new territories of endpoints that are being collected. A lot of things that used to be collected on site are being rapidly transitioned to being collected at home or through a new method that's less based on the official investigator site visit. How do we think about ensuring that that migration is regulatory compliant? I know that some of the larger companies have the capabilities to operate validation studies to ensure that certain method of collecting an endpoint is equivalent to a traditional method. But barring that, what are the approaches we can take from the sponsor perspective to ensure that as we adapt an endpoint to be at home, we are doing it within a way that's going to be accepted by the agency?
Well, I did just drop into the Zoom chat a link for folks that were curious for more in the FDA's perspective, because while there is not an explicit guidance on decentralized trials, and it is referenced, of course, in the FDA's guidance for companies running studies during COVID, much of their view is reflected in the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, the CITY work stream that produced recommendations on decentralized trials, which was largely championed by the FDA from its outset. And so I think it does represent a nice lens on the topic. But I think as we start to think about endpoints themselves, I think we have to start with the appreciation that in the end, we have been developing and validating new endpoints for decades. I think sometimes we all get lost in the idea that this is digital and that it's new, and therefore we look up to the regulators and say, guide us, because we're lost without you. And in truth, we have pathways with the regulators that we've used for years for developing and validating new endpoints, for understanding what it means to generate new evidence against an existing gold standard, and the pathways for being able to engage with the regulators prior to starting a study to be able to share that evidence and build their support. We've also seen for years that this is a space that we can do in a pre-competitive or pro-competitive or collaborative way, either with partner companies or with peers across the industry. And so to me, a lot of the stage setting in terms of regulatory perspective is to rely a lot on precedent as we start to think about our pathways for creating new endpoints together. And then, just as I pointed out with CITY, that there are existing resources available, many of the people on this call have worked with CITY and other groups to start to lay out the framework for how we validate these new endpoints together. And so there are some examples that work streams at CITY have been producing, showing in different therapeutic areas the pathways towards validation. So those, at least to me, are some of the opening signals that this is not uncharted waters, that there are pathways that we have followed before, and that the FDA has sent some very clear signals in terms of the type of process that we should continue to follow. But I think Andy can probably speak very well to some of the universe of new endpoints that companies have been developing and validating along the way and sharing in a public way.
I'm happy to do that. So the probably two follow-ups. So CITY, the executive director of CITY, is on in the audience right now. Her name's Pam, and she has been posting a couple more resources for people in the chat that you're welcome to look at. CITY is this public-private consortia between Duke and the FDA and about, I think, 80 other member companies. But Pam, you can correct me if I'm wrong, so you can check those out. I would say that, to Craig's point just now, that I think one of the things that one thing obviously that unlocks any of these decentralized trials is that the FDA accepts the data that you're going to submit to them, right? That's kind of like the foundational point. And one of the chicken and the egg things that's happening is the agency has really been pushing, and I'm speaking in my own personal capacity, the FDA has been really pushing to collect more patient-centered data, and they've run a number of really interesting public workshops that I would highly recommend that you join around how to collect more patient-centered data. And one of the ways is using some of these different sensors. The challenge is industry is looking to the FDA to say, hey, how are we regulated? And the FDA is looking to industry and saying, hey, these technologies are new, what should we do? And everyone's kind of like talking past each other. And so I think one place that would be really powerful, especially given how open the agency is that they have issued a number of public guidances and then an open comment period where you can ship, or like you can write up some of your perspectives in this public docket, and I'll share information about how you can do that. And so I have found the agency to be extremely forward thinking, and often the reticence isn't because the agency isn't going to accept it. It's really because companies have been more hesitant to submit. So I would encourage you to lean into the process. I mean, more specifically to Craig's question, the areas where some of the sensors are the most useful are accelerometers and gyroscopes are pretty advanced and good. And so anything that has movement disorders or movement related endpoints are pretty strong. There's a group called the Digital Medicine Society, which is a 501c3 nonprofit that I'll share some info for. And they have published a crowdsourced list of over 119 endpoints that have been used as primary and secondary. So not just exploratory for digital tools. And I'll post that in the chat as well.
Awesome.
I'll make a quick point, Tom, about sort of the why of all this, and Craig kind of alluded to it too. You know, a decentralized trial, that maybe the word decentralized, the other part of it is that the current climate, sort of centralized trials, that represents 3% of the physician landscape, which, you know, if you look at the polling between physicians, 3% of them will participate in clinical research. Less than 3% will refer outside their practice group. So that functionally means 95% of us have no direct access to clinical trials. And if you look at the promise of digital decentralized trials and complex endpoints being able to move out into places like where patients get their regular care, where they're comfortable going on a regular basis, or at home, the ability to add 95% new volume, new capacity, really new access is really cool just as a denominator solution. But then you think about what are some other real problems in clinical trials? You think about the access, diversity, right? Like why are we looking at such a homogenous group of people over and over again? Part of that is because where centralization has brought clinical research. So there's a real promise too to be able to use these kinds of tools to bring research opportunities everywhere. And that's really, really interesting. And that's, Andy, your point on the FDA is exactly right. At the beginning, our assumption was, well, the answer is going to be no, and we're not going to be able to figure this out. When you talk to them, the answer is really, oh, you're working on that? That's great. What does that look like? And how do you want, how should we engage to help you with this? So I think this window in particular is the sea change for it. And Tom, the kind of stuff that really what Curebase is talking about with putting access wherever the patient is, that's the gold standard, I think, for where we're headed.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting, and I agree that decentralized research doesn't entirely mean at home. At home is a big portion of it, but I know your business here, Fun, is utilizing new categories of healthcare providers, perhaps less of the traditional academic investigators, to expand access for types of procedures that cannot be done at home, but can still be expanded to a lot more diverse patients. And we do share a similar thesis, and a lot of our business involves incorporating new categories of providers as well. And I think this actually intersects really well with the regulatory question and the validation questions, because not all ways of getting complex endpoints in decentralized trial are new endpoints. Some of it is traditional endpoints, just changing the clinical operations process. Who are the sites? Can we have far more sites? Can we utilize patients, existing healthcare providers, mobile providers? So I think from a regulatory perspective and a validation perspective, I'm really interested to know what the group thinks around how do you get confidence around new methods and new clinical operations methods for collecting endpoints and utilizing new categories of providers as well.
So I think that actually touches on a question we got from Rena about how innovation is keeping pace and whether or not we're actually seeing things that are sort of complicated measurements or measurements that really fit the bill, as opposed to just basic information and data. So I'll jump in there quickly, and then very eager for everything else others have to say. So digital innovation is another broad term to turn around. So let me just talk about what we do at HealthMode. So we often think of what is it you're actually trying to measure? How have you been measuring it currently? And then is there a way that we could do that is less burden on the patient, is more objective? And usually we're also looking for something that might be continuous. So you just, even if you don't want to look at every single data point over a 24 or 48 a week period, at least you can start to look at data more frequently than the every 2 weeks or once a month you see a patient. And so I think about this in something like the measurement we have for performance status, which is really a platform. It combines a range of tools. There are the familiar ones like in ePro, the really basic ones like a Bluetooth scale, so you can get the weight that comes right up into whatever your platform is, and the patient doesn't have to try to put it in a diary every day. But then you start to get these more sort of, I don't want to use the word complex, but these more multi-stream data sets that you can use. So you have the person with a wrist wearable and phone that is going to get their movements and energy usage during the day. And you have every single stream from the gyroscope to the accelerometry. You can tell when they're moving their hands because of the wrist wearable, as opposed to when they're actually up and walking around and moving their whole body. And then you analyze those streams sort of against whatever question you're asking to shape the measurement. So in my mind, yes, innovation is happening for you to go beyond the basics of just folks putting more information in a diary, or they're doing the same, they're answering the same questions you always ask them, but they're doing it on their watch now. You can actually get this sort of passive integral data to like how they're actually moving and living their life each day. However, those are not yet sort of blessed as endpoints for pivotal trials, right? So you've got to do the work to build them up. And that's where there's kind of a little bit of a lag, or we're trying to kind of move everything in parallel as fast as we can, but we're not totally there yet. So the innovation is there 100%. I'm sure everybody on this call has like 1,700 other ideas of the things that they're working on that are just as exciting, but they haven't necessarily gone through all the stages yet to be demonstrated as an endpoint. And frankly, people get skittish. Like, you know, your phase 3 is not the time to jump into the exciting new digital innovation. You want to start with your phase 1 so that, you know, you're building the case with FDA all along the way. You know, I really think that this is cooperative with the regulators. You know, I've always had the experience that they're welcoming pretty much this new direction that we want to go in, but everybody wants to make sure that it's safe and it's truly value added.
There's a great note in the comments. It says, not everything that can be measured should be measured. Is there a surfeit of unvalidated, superfluous endpoints and data collected? Is that the Achilles heel of digital? So that concept is actually a principle in philosophy called reification, right? That the act of measuring implies that the measurement is valid. And it's a great point. I mean, the process that needs to happen is really the endpoint is measured and it's found to be meaningful. And I'll toss it over to Andy, who's clearly the expert on this, but I think that's a great observation.
I'm muted. I don't know if I'm necessarily the expert on this. I would say there's definitely reasons not to collect data. I mean, I think this is also not only because of unvalidated or superfluous data, but what if you get data you didn't expect, right? I think there's a ton of pharma companies that are nervous to collect data, and then they'd have to respond to do that. I do think it's in that instance the right thing to collect data so that you're getting a better set of information. I think something that most people also don't think about, especially in the world that we work in, which is a lot of these sensors and wearables, all of these are generally connected to the internet. And when you're collecting this amount of data, you really can't have personalized medicine or personalized care without surveillance. I mean, we call it in healthcare surveillance, but most people think about surveillance as being very different. And the amount of information that you're collecting on people, I mean, think about how much tech companies collect on us. That is a lot, and definitely has pretty significant data liberty considerations and privacy considerations and security considerations. And so as you think about adopting some of these tools, and you're going to be collecting this much information, really making sure that your team has a good security background and has a good data rights background to know what and why you're collecting this sort of information, whether or not that's meaningful and is the adequate benefit against the risk that you're putting on a person for collecting that sort of information.
I think we got a great question from Arvin. I'm actually going to flip over here, but this is around how do we ensure, and thank you, Andy, for telling us about the privacy and security needs, especially with all that data going up. It needs to be protected. But there's also the question of, as more of the data collection is shifting onto the patient, especially with DCT, especially with wearables, there are new opportunities for variability. So how do we ensure when we are pushing data collection onto patients with wearables, with other take-home devices, that we're reducing the variability, increasing standardization, especially when it involves aspects of exact placement and potential for user error?
I can
Tell you
speak
what
to
we can't do. We can't just push it to the site and expect them to be the genius bar for every patient using a device. So Irfan, why don't you go ahead with what we can do?
It was very much the same point I was going to make, is that that what we've seen work is when there is complexity to the actual process of getting the sensor, the wearable in place. That's a great use of tele, and to think of all the parties as aligned. So the company producing the technology, the sponsor, the site, and the patient are kind of collaborating essentially. And the asset that's really useful there is training. We again with platform adoption now kind of at an all-time high, the idea is that there's an expectation at the site that if you want us to deploy this to the patient and the patient's going to do it at home, what's the support for the patient doing it? If you want us to do it in the room, what's the process in which we assure that we're doing this correctly, the way that, so when we're done, it isn't, hey, this data needs to be cleaned up because it's a complete mess coming in. And I think what we've seen even in the last 3 or 4 months now, we've had a couple of examples where very quickly people are like, well, let's all just Zoom it out together. And I think that's really that ability to use tele in that way to connect the vendor that may have the absolute product expertise to the deployment is really cool.
Tom, I can't help but notice how we've talked about the need for certain technical expertise to think about what technologies can support measurement. We've talked about privacy expertise to better understand the important details around some of the technologies that may be included. We've talked about special types of support that may be needed for the different users. And I think for many clinical operations professionals, this is intimidating, right? Because none of those roles exist on their core team for a conventional trial today. So we're talking about all sorts of new people that they either have to identify in their organization who can help them, or from external partners and organizations that can help them. And one thing that's clear is I think many large companies are starting to better organize around some of these challenges. They are starting to put together those distributed teams across different areas of expertise. But I think equally important, we're seeing a lot of important, I'll call them niche solutions in different categories here that are emerging in the market to help study teams on this journey, to make it easier for them and less daunting and burdensome, whether that means what does concierge type of support look like for patients to ensure they know what they're able to use, straight through to platforms that can help with guidance and decision making around the right devices and hardware to include in their studies.
And how do those teams intersect with the role of the research site? And the vast majority of clinical trials do, and we'll continue to have many research sites involved. I think Irfan, this would actually probably be an area where you've probably thought more than the rest of us in particular about the balance of moving burden from the site to the patient, but also to folks like Craig's mentioning, concierge teams, remote patient support teams, et cetera. How does the shift of of that support and the site burden. How should we be thinking about that right now?
Yeah, I'll share our perspective. It's created interesting opportunities for some of the work we do, where we are initially brought on to sort of provide site, to be the site or to create the site out of thin air. And as a result of that, get asked, hey, we are having the same kind of problem that you solved over here in another space. I think you framed it best, Tom, that it is about, I think the sponsors are doing a better job than ever of looking at site burden and saying, we see that in the critical path to success in this project, especially with what's going on with COVID. So what are the tools that are out there that normally we wouldn't have considered that we're open to now? And what we've ended up doing a couple of times is suggesting solutions that friends of ours provide. And we're like, well, we don't, one company can't be everything to everybody. The real question is, what are you open to? But I would agree that that's a major problem. So a good example is you have a research site that does 1 or 2 trials a year. They do it because they want to provide access. Often we've seen these in diverse population practice centers, where it's really one investigator that really likes the idea of bringing clinical trials to those patients. Really limited resource set, is not going to be doing really complicated work. And now patients aren't even coming into the office, and they've sent back to us, hey, we're on this trial with you. Is there anything else we can be using? And we've passed that back upstream to sort of say, there are some things that are available that we haven't traditionally used, you haven't sent our way. And certainly, good, virtual visit platforms, I think, are at the top of that list in terms of being able to pull burden off and to change the demographic. For me, that's the real payoff is, I think there was a question from Arvin that I really loved. How would you define success? It's going to be different for everybody who looks at it, but I think success in decentralized trials for us, one really nice marker would be, let's look 3 years out and see, did we move the needle at all from 5% participation in the diverse populations? This should be the path towards that if we hack it correctly.
I definitely agree. I think success is being able to recruit better and faster so that you're able to have a more robust population faster. I think another success, if it's done well, is that you can collect a lot better data, and you might be able to run the whole study faster, which I think allows to do more innovative trial designs. Also, for people who are new to what we're working on, a lot of the questions that are coming in, we're splitting between the Q&A and the chat. And so if you haven't been opening up those, you can see some of the panelists have been posting extra resources and other tools here. I think this is one of the benefits of using Zoom is we get to answer live, and then you can look up something. So please engage with us, and you can do that in the chat and the Q&A.
Great call. I think, and I do love Zoom for that reason. It's great to make this, a conversation with everybody. I think some of the measurements that are most on the minds of some of the operations people today are around data quality and data integrity. And so having confidence around the quality of their data, and then being able to measure patient factors, whether that means participant recruitment, retention, participant experience, and as we were mentioning at the outset, our ability to influence and impact and improve the course of patient diversity and representation. But I think an important measurement that we're going to be seeing over the next 2-3 years is the impact of the regulatory submissions and reviews of the medicines that were in development during 2020, because we have an entire global portfolio of drugs that were in development from March through July that were in clinical trials that had to pivot. And these are not going to the FDA tomorrow. These studies are going to be going on through 21, 22, 23. They're going to be submitted over the next year to 4 years. And so review divisions inside of the FDA are going to be seeing the measurement strategies that different organizations have taken and having to react to those. And so I think we're going to see a continuous stream of different feedback from the regulators in multiple review divisions, not just in dermatology or another review division, but across our portfolios. And I hope that's going to give us all some very constructive feedback to be able to adapt. Of course, I also hope that the regulators will remember 2020. That's almost like a new hashtag I want to start, because when they're reviewing a medicine in 2023 and hopefully COVID-19 is behind us, I hope that they'll remember the circumstances and that study teams did their absolute best to document all the decisions that they made during this time around their measurement strategies.
Absolutely. I'm going to pick up a question from one of our audience members, Aaron, about imaging. So Aaron asks, can you speak to the methods for collecting data about endpoints requiring medical imaging? I think this ties in nicely to some of the conversation we were just having, Craig Irfan, about, we are shifting some burden away from the site. We're using things like telemedicine. We've obviously talked extensively about app point on collection, wearables, et cetera. But there will still be some site burden, however you define the site, because there is imaging, there are procedures. So just going deep on the imaging, which is such an important endpoint for so many trials, especially when you go into oncology trials, it's so important. How should we be thinking about this in a decentralized context? Are there ways to expand patient access to trials that involve imaging as a fundamental key endpoint?
I think one thing we can't lose sight of, and first of all, hello, Aaron, and thank you for the question on this one. I think we can't lose sight that our conventional oncology studies today involve a vast number of oncology centers that do not have imaging centers on site. And it's more the norm than the exception that we are writing up image acquisition guidelines to be followed when patients are getting their follow-up imaging in oncology studies from offsite imaging centers. Many studies in oncology take advantage of imaging core labs that do this for a living and have done it for a living for 2 decades. I know because I used to run one 2 decades ago, and we did very well in this category around oncology, where so the norm here is available to us. And I think it's a misconception for us to believe that we're constrained in oncology with the mindset that the imaging has to be acquired at the investigator site. The imaging has to be acquired in a robust and standardized way, the quality of which should be understood and evaluated after the image is acquired. We've done that now for several decades, and we can do the same with a decentralized trial simply by stopping thinking that everything always happened at the site, because it hasn't.
Craig, just to echo on that, I mean, it's not that different than what you see in a lot of cardiology, where the echo is, sent from a site where it was collected to the team that's going to, neutrally review these things. And I think that is very similar to that. They're willing to accept the echo done at that site as essentially equivalent to the echo done on the other side of the country to give it review. And I think that same principle applies to this potential for changing how we collect and where we collect and what the anxiety is over that.
Irfan, when I first made the pitch for the remote trial at Pfizer 17 years ago, I had a copy of Clayton Christensen's book on my desk at the time. And one of the lean-ins that he was evangelizing was how centralization in healthcare would enable decentralized access to healthcare services. Centralization of healthcare services like specialty medical centers would enable the proliferation of improved access at minute clinics and other types of primary care outlets. And there was a lot of that mindset. I included, a screenshot of one of their graphics in our original slide deck with exactly this point. We've been centralizing labs, echo reads, image analysis. We've been centralizing so much for years. We've been doing all of the lead work that was required for exactly where we are today, to be able to decentralize our studies and take advantage of the infrastructure we've already built. For some of our studies now, that just means we're centralizing an investigator site to enable decentralized participation. But even when there is still a local site, we can democratize access into our studies by taking advantage of this model that already exists.
I think that's been a huge part of our model as well, and that insight that centralization and decentralization are sort of joined at the hip. You can centralize aspects of oversight, of key procedures, of telemedicine procedures, of the concierge care, and by taking some of the site burden off, you can then broaden where the research is capable of being done. Our guest Nicole actually asked a question about this. I'm thinking it may have been motivated by this. But basically, there is a lot of complexity that comes out of this now. And I think a big part of decentralized design here is a lot of compartmentalization. We have sometimes virtual investigators. We have more sites or community sites involved. We have more patient participation. How should we think about coordinating all of these methods and ensuring that quality is really, really tightly controlled? And is there even any validation we can do on some of the unique coordination designs to ensure that it's being effective?
I think there's lots of, it kind of depends what people mean by validation. I think that that term's used like quite loosely. And so there are different types of validation. So like validation for an individual technology might look different. So for example, when you validate a survey, it's a different type of validation. You might use construct validity, content validity. There's a series of different validations that would be different from validating a sensor. So I think one of the questions is, and then sensors have verification, analytical validation, and clinical validation. And so there are different like stages along the way. I think probably one of the most important things is not to think about validation as kind of like a checkbox exercise, like this is now validated, you know, kind of like you wouldn't say like this system is now secure. Like you are constantly in a process of securing a system. You're constantly in the process of validating a set of tools and a set of processes. So I think it's more of like a validation mindset than like a stop gate, like this is now validated.
Absolutely. Okay. So I'm going to pull up another question from Aaron. Whatever trial Aaron has in mind, I'm very curious to know what it is. But similar to the imaging question of how we expand to new imaging based endpoints and get that data in a more broad sense, what about other biomarker based endpoints? So we're looking at genetic and genomic markers in a decentralized approach. Can those be incorporated in a way that dramatically expands patient access as well? And how do we include that type of data collection into decentralized endpoints?
I think in many of these instances, the challenge is just how do we acquire the specimen? And what we choose to do with the specimen from that point can follow very much our existing workflows and data flows. And in many cases, continue to allow us to operate with many of the same back-end partners that we are already using, that we already trust for analytics. And so on the front end, can we deploy a kit? Is there a technology like Tasso to be able to place on a patient's arm and enable a blood draw in the home, to be done by themselves? Do we deploy home health professionals into the patient's home to acquire the specimen? But however we choose is best for that particular artifact to be acquired, most of the rest of the flow already exists for us. And importantly, for most of our organizations on the sponsor side, can let us use trusted partners that we've already qualified in data flows to be able to recover those data back that we've already used for conventional study models.
I think that's even more reinforcing the idea that decentralized is centralized. And if it's fully decentralized, you can even select a single partner who might be able to process and procure all of those biospecimens. But Jamila, it looked like you were about to.
Yeah, I was just going to agree and remind folks that you really can get your patients or participants to do a lot for you. Just you got to make sure you have clear instructions, whether that's utilizing the telemedicine visit to really help make sure they're comfortable with how the technology is going to work or where it's going to be placed on them, or how to do a little finger prick test. You have to have pretty people-proof reagents. So when you think about if they've got to do something and take this sample and take this swab and put it in something, like make sure that they don't have to mix or anything, that it's all sort of pre-done for them, and all they have to do is like dip it in there and turn it and it locks, and then they can mail it off. So you have to people-proof the process a little bit, but it's very doable at home.
Great. And I see Andy is about to chime in here as well.
Yeah, well, I think there's an interesting question here for people around, I'm assuming what they mean by DDT is a drug development tools, and whether or not, I think it's kind of provocative, and why not put a provocative question at the end of a session? Should drug development tools and these sorts of things just be handled by companies, or what is the role of the patient? Can patients develop the drugs and the tools? And this is, a person asked, this is why patients are called patients. I mean, I think we should never forget why we do all the work that we do, is to make sure that people are getting the measures that they care about, and that they can, I think nobody wants to be a patient. I mean, maybe some people do, but largely, like, we all, if we are patients or we serve patients, people want to live their normal lives, which is why I think decentralized trials are so powerful, because you don't have to necessarily go into a site. And so I think one of the questions now is like, what is the role? Is there like some sort of biohacking, or can you develop new tools, or how does that whole process work? there's a ton of really interesting groups that have been a role model for this. So for example, one of the patient communities that's been really active in the digital side is patients who have diabetes. And so people have created their own continuous glucometers and then created these artificial pancreases and then put their code up on GitHub. And then many groups like Medtronic and Dexcom have released artificial pancreases that look very similar to these sorts of groups who have been making their own measurement and interventions. And so I think as a person, it's just really important possibly to, I mean, obviously you should definitely, I'm not advocating people like go rogue on their own tools, but I think there's a lot of democratization that can happen. And so as I do also just want to remind people that the reason that the FDA is so interesting is it is not driven, it doesn't have a profit and loss. Like it's not driven by making more money. Like I'm sure there's all reasons why, there are reasons people are not, happy always with the FDA, but it literally is there to serve you. And there are roles that the FDA can play where you can submit public comments. If you've never submitted a public comment, you should do this. Your regulators are not responsible to read your tweets. They're not responsible to watch this webinar. They're not responsible to look at the questions that we have here, but they are responsible to respond to every single comment that you submit in a public docket. And it is very annoying to be on the other side having to comment on all of those, but it is their responsibility. So if you don't tell them in a formal channel, they can't respond. And so I would highly recommend engaging in the formal channels that the agency has, because you can have outsized power, because a lot of people are not commenting on these guidances, like who spent their Saturday writing back to the FDA. So you really can get a view, and I'll send you some information about how you can participate in a more formal channel to engage with the regulators as an individual and as a company.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, a lot of our panelists are busy either with exactly what comes next at the top of the hour. So we are at time here. You can send any follow-up questions to us here at Curebase, and we'll be happy to follow up and try to get your questions answered. But thank you so much, everyone, for attending, learning a bit about what the future of complex endpoint collection and what what comes next for decentralized clinical trials. And please follow up if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone on the panel, for joining.